Chapter 7. The Russian Empire to 1917. In the 19th century, most historians regarded Russia as part of Europe, but it is now becoming increasingly clear that Russia is another civilization quite separate from Western civilization. Both of these civilizations are descended from classical civilization, but the connection with the predecessor was made so differently that two quite different traditions came into existence. Russian traditions were derived from Byzantium directly. Western traditions were derived from the more moderate classical civilization indirectly, having passed through the Dark Ages, when there was no state or government in the West. Russian civilization was created from three sources originally: 1. The Slav people, 2. Viking invaders from the north, and 3. The Byzantine tradition from the south. These three were fused together as the result of a common experience arising from Russia's exposed geographical position on the western edge of a great flatland stretching for thousands of miles to the east. This flatland is divided horizontally into three zones, of which the most southern is open plain, while the most northern is open bush and tundra. The middle zone is forest. The southern zone, or steppes, consists of two parts. The southern is a salty plain, which is practically useless, while the northern part, next to the forest, is the famous Black Earth region, of rich agricultural soil. Unfortunately, the eastern portion of this great Eurasian plain has been getting steadily drier for thousands of years, with the consequence that the Ural Altaic-speaking peoples of Central and East Central Asia, people like the Huns, Bulgars, Magyars, Mongols and Turks, have pushed westward repeatedly along the steppe corridor between the Urals and the Caspian Sea, making the Black Earth steppes dangerous for sedentary agricultural peoples. The Slavs first appeared more than 2,000 years ago as a peaceful, evasive people with an economy based on hunting and rudimentary agriculture in the forests of eastern Poland. These peoples slowly increased in numbers, moving northeastward through the forests, mixing with the scattered Finnish hunting people who were already there. About AD 700 or so, the Northmen, who we know as Vikings, came down from the Baltic Sea by way of the rivers of Eastern Europe, and eventually reached the Black Sea and attacked Constantinople. These Northmen were trying to make a way of life out of militarism, seizing booty and slaves, imposing tribute on conquered peoples, collecting first honey and wax from the timid Slavs lurking in their forests, and exchanging these for the colorful products of the Byzantine south. In time, the Northmen set up fortified trading posts along their river highways, notably at Novgorod in the north, at Smolensk in the center, and at Kiev in the south. They married Slav women and imposed on the rudimentary agricultural hunting economy of the Slavs a superstructure of a tribute-collecting state with an exploitative, militaristic, commercial economy. This created the pattern of a two-class Russian society, which has continued ever since, much intensified by subsequent historical events. In time, the ruling class of Russia became acquainted with Byzantine culture. They were dazzled by it, and sought to import it into their wilderness domains in the north. In this way, they imposed on the Slav peoples many of the accessories of the Byzantine Empire, such as Orthodox Christianity, the Byzantine alphabet, the Byzantine calendar, the use of domed ecclesiastical architecture, the name Tsar, Caesar, for their ruler, and innumerable other traits. Most important of all, they imported the Byzantine totalitarian autocracy, under which all aspects of life, including political, economic, intellectual, and religious, were regarded as departments of government under the control of an autocratic ruler. These beliefs were part of the Greek tradition, and were based ultimately on Greek inability to distinguish between state and society. Since society includes all human activities, the Greeks had assumed that the state must include all human activities. In the days of classical Greece, this all-inclusive entity was called a polis, a term which meant both society and state. It meant city too. In the later Roman period, this all-inclusive entity was called the imperium. The only difference was that the polis was sometimes, as in Pericles' Athens about 450 BC, democratic, while the imperium was always a military autocracy. Both were totalitarian, so that religion and economic life were regarded as spheres of governmental activity. This totalitarian autocratic tradition was carried on to the Byzantine Empire and passed from it to the Russian state in the north and to the later Ottoman Empire in the south. In the north, this Byzantine tradition combined with the experience of the Northmen to intensify the two-class structure of Slav society. In the new Slav or Orthodox civilization, this fusion, fitting together the Byzantine tradition and the Viking tradition, created Russia. From Byzantium came autocracy and the idea of the state as an absolute power and as a totalitarian power, as well as such important applications of these principles as the idea that the state should control thought and religion, that the church should be a branch of the government, that law is an enactment of the state, and that the ruler is semi-divine. From the Vikings came the idea that the state is a foreign importation, based on militarism, and supported by booty and tribute. That economic innovations are the function of the government, that power rather than law is the basis of social life, and that society, with its people and its property, is the private property of a foreign ruler. These concepts of the Russian system must be emphasized because they are so foreign to our own traditions. In the West, the Roman Empire, which continued in the East as the Byzantine Empire, disappeared in 476. And although many efforts were made to revive it, there was clearly a period about 900 when there was no empire, no state, and no public authority in the West. The state disappeared, yet society continued. So also religious and economic life continued. This clearly showed that the state and society were not the same thing. The society was the basic entity, and that the state was a crowning, but not essential, cap to the social structure. This experience had revolutionary effects. It was discovered that man can live without a state. This became the basis of Western liberalism. It was discovered that the state, if it exists, must serve man, and that it is incorrect to believe that the purpose of man is to serve the state. It was discovered that economic life, religious life, law, and private property can all exist and function effectively without a state. From this emerged laissez-faire, separation of church and state, rule of law, and the sanctity of private property. In Rome, in Byzantium, and in Russia, law was regarded as an enactment of a supreme power, In the West, when no supreme power existed, it was discovered that law still existed as the body of rules which governed social life. Thus law was found by observation in the West, not enacted by autocracy as in the East. This meant that authority was established by law and under the law in the West, while authority was established by power and above the law in the East. The West felt that the rules of economic life were found and not enacted, that individuals had rights independent of and even opposed to public authority, that groups could exist as the Church existed, by right and not by privilege, and without the need to have any charter or incorporation entitling them to exist as a group or act as a group, that groups or individuals could own property as a right and not as a privilege, and that such property could not be taken by force, but must be taken by established process of law. It was emphasized that in the West that the way a thing was done was more important than what was done, while in the East what was done was far more significant than the way in which it was done. There was another basic distinction between Western civilization and Russian civilization. This was derived from the history of Christianity. This new faith came into classical civilization from Semitic society. In its origin, it was a this-worldly religion, believing that the world and the flesh were basically good, or at least filled with good potentialities, because both were made by God. The body was made in the image of God. God became man in this world with a human body, to serve men as individuals, and to establish, quote, peace on earth. The early Christians had intensified this worldly tradition, insisting that salvation was possible only because God lived and died in a human body in this world, and the individual could be saved only through God's help, grace, and by living correctly in this body on this earth, good works. There would be some day a millennium on this earth, and that at that last judgment there would be a resurrection of the body, and life everlasting. In this way, the world of space and time, which God had made at the beginning with the statement it was good, Book of Genesis, would at the end be restored in its original condition. This optimistic, this worldly religion was taken into classical civilization at a time when the philosophic outlook of their society was quite incompatible with the religious outlook of Christianity. The classical philosophic outlook, which we might call Neoplatonic, was derived from the teachings of Persian Zoroastrianism, Pythagorean rationalism, and Platonism. It was dualistic, dividing the universe into two opposed worlds, the world of matter and flesh and the world of spirit and ideas. The former world was changeable, unknowable, illusionary and evil. The latter world was eternal, knowable, real and good. Truth to these people could be found by the use of reason and logic alone, not by use of the body or the senses, since these were prone to error and must be spurned. The body, as Plato said, was the tomb of the soul. Thus the classical world into which Christianity came about AD 60 believed that the world and the body were unreal, unknowable, corrupt and hopeless, and that no truth or success could be found by the use of the body, the senses or matter. A small minority, derived from Democritus and the early Ionian scientists through Aristotle, Epicurus and Lucretius, rejected the Platonic dualism, preferring materialism as an explanation of reality. These materialists were equally incompatible with the new Christian religion. Moreover, even the ordinary citizen of Rome had an outlook whose implications were not compatible with the Christian religion. To give one simple example, while the Christians spoke of a millennium in the future, the average Roman continued to think of a golden age in the past, just as Homer did, or just as Homer held, as a consequence of the fact that Christian religion came into a society with an incompatible philosophic outlook. The Christian religion was ravaged by theological and dogmatic disputes and shot through with otherworldly heresies. In general, these heresies felt that God was so perfect and so remote, and man was so imperfect and such a worm, that the gap between God and man could not be bridged by any act of man, that salvation depended on grace rather than on good works, and that if God ever did so lower himself as to occupy a human body, this was not an ordinary body, and that accordingly Christ could be either true God or true man, but could not be both. This point of view was opposed by the Christian fathers of the Church, not always successfully, but in the decisive battle at the First Church Council held at Nicaea in 325, the Christian point of view was enacted into the formal dogma of the Church. Although the Church continued to exist for centuries thereafter, in a society whose philosophic outlook was ill-adapted to the Christian religion, and obtained a compatible philosophy only in the medieval period, the basic outlook of Christianity reinforced the experience of the Dark Ages to create the outlook of Western civilization. Some of the elements of this outlook which were of great importance were the following. 1. The importance of the individual, since he alone is saved. 2. The potential goodness of the material world and of the body. 3. The need to seek salvation by use of the body and the senses in this world good works. 4. Faith in the reliability of the senses, which contributed much to Western science. 5. Faith in the reality of ideas, which contributed much to Western mathematics. 6. Mundane optimism and millennialism, which contributed much to faith in the future and the idea of progress. 7. The belief that God and not the devil reigns over this world by a system of established rules, which contributed much to the ideas of natural law, natural science, and the rule of law. These ideas, which became part of the tradition of the West, did not become part of the tradition of Russia. The influence of Greek philosophic thought remained strong in the East. The Latin West, before 900, used a language which was not, at that time, fitted for abstract discussion, and almost all the dogmatic debates which arose from the incompatibility of Greek philosophy and Christian religion were carried on in the Greek language and fed on the Greek philosophic tradition. In the West, the Latin language reflected a quite different tradition based on the Roman emphasis on administrative procedures and ethical ideas about human behavior to one's fellow man. As a result, the Greek philosophic tradition remained strong in the East, continued to permeate the Greek-speaking church, and went with that church into the Slavic north. The schism between the Latin Church and the Greek Church strengthened their different points of view, the former being more this worldly, more concerned with human behavior, and continuing to believe in the efficacy of good works, while the latter was more otherworldly, more concerned with God's majesty and power, and emphasized the evilness and weakness of the body and the world and the efficacy of God's grace. As a result, the religious outlook, and accordingly the world outlook of Slav religion and philosophy, developed in quite a different direction from that in the West. The body, this world, pain, personal comfort, and even death were of little importance. man could do little to change his lot, which was determined by forces more powerful than he. Resignation to fate, pessimism, and a belief in the overwhelming power of sin and of the devil dominated the East. To this point we have seen the Slavs formed into Russian civilization as the result of several factors. Before we go on, we should perhaps recapitulate. The Slavs were subjected at first to the Viking exploitative system. These Vikings copied Byzantine culture and did it very consciously in their religion, in their writing, in their state, in their laws, in art, architecture, philosophy, and literature. These rulers were outsiders who innovated all the political, religious, economic, and intellectual life of the new civilization. There was no state. Foreigners brought one in. There was no organized religion. One was imported from Byzantium and imposed on the Slavs. The Slav economic life was on a low level, a forest subsistence economy, with hunting and rudimentary agriculture. On this the Vikings imposed an international trading system. There was no religious philosophic outlook. The new state church superstructure imposed on the Slavs an outlook derived from Greek dualistic idealism. And finally, the East never experienced a Dark Ages, to show it that society is distinct from the state and more fundamental than the state. This summary brings Russian society down to about 1200. In the next 600 years, new experiences merely intensified the Russian development. These experiences arose from the fact that the new Russian society found itself caught between the population pressures of the raiders from the steppes to the east and the pressure of the advancing technology of Western civilization. The pressure of the Ural-Altaic speakers from the eastern steppes culminated in the Mongol Tatar invasions after 1200. The Mongols conquered Russia and established a tribute-gathering system, which continued for generations. Thus there continued to be a foreign exploiting system imposed over the Slav people. In time the Mongols made the princes of Moscow their chief tribute collectors for most of Russia. A little later the Mongols made a court of highest appeal in Moscow, so that both money and judicial cases flowed to Moscow. These continued to flow even after the princes of Moscow, 1380, led the successful revolt which ejected the Mongols. As the population pressure from the east decreased, the technological pressure from the west increased after 1500. By Western technology we mean such things as gunpowder and firearms, better agriculture, counting and public finance, sanitation, printing, and the spread of education. Russia did not get the full impact of these pressures until late, and then from secondary sources, such as Sweden and Poland, rather than from England or France. However, Russia was hammered out between the pressures from the east and those from the west. The result of this hammering was the Russian autocracy, a military tribute-gathering machine superimposed on the Slav population. The poverty of this population made it impossible for them to get firearms or any other advantages of Western technology. Only the state had these things. But the state could afford them only by draining wealth from the people. This draining of wealth from below upward provided arms and Western technology for the rulers, but kept the ruled too poor to obtain these things. so that all power was concentrated at the top. The continued pressure from the West made it impossible for the rulers to use the wealth that accumulated in their hands to finance economic improvements which might have raised the standards of living of the ruled, since this accumulation had to be used to increase Russian power rather than Russian wealth. As a consequence, pressure downward increased, and the autocracy became more autocratic. In order to get a bureaucracy for the army and for government service, the landlords were given personal powers over the peasants, creating a system of serfdom in the East just at the time that medieval serfdom was disappearing in the West. Private property, personal freedom, and direct contact with the state for taxation or for justice were lost to the Russian serfs. The landlords were given these powers so that the landlords would be free to fight and willing to fight for Moscow, or to serve in Moscow's autocracy. By 1730, the direct pressure of the West upon Russia began to weaken somewhat, because of the decline of Sweden, of Poland, and of Turkey, while Prussia was too occupied with Austria and with France to press very forcibly on Russia. Thus the Slavs, using an adopted Western technology of a rudimentary character, were able to impose their supremacy on the peoples to the east. The peasants of Russia, seeking to escape from the pressures of serfdom in the area west of the Urals, began to flee eastward and eventually reached the Pacific. The Russian state made every effort to stop this movement because it felt that the peasants must remain to work the land and pay taxes if the landlords were to be able to maintain the military autocracy, which was considered necessary. Eventually the autocracy followed the peasants eastward, and Russian society came to occupy the whole of northern Asia. As the pressure from the east and the pressure from the west declined, the autocracy, inspired perhaps by powerful religious feelings, began to have a bad conscience towards its own people. At the same time, it still sought to westernize itself. It became increasingly clear that this process of westernization could not be restricted to the autocracy itself, but must be extended downward to include the Russian people. The autocracy found in 1812 that it could not defeat Napoleon's army without calling on the Russian people. Its inability to defeat the Western Allies in the Crimean War of 1854 to 1856, and the growing threat of the Central Powers after the Austro-German alliance of 1879, made it clear that Russia must be westernized in technology if not in ideology, throughout all classes of the society in order to survive. This meant very specifically that Russia had to obtain the agricultural revolution and industrialism, but these in turn required that ability to read and write be extended to the peasants, and that the rural population be reduced and the urban population be increased. These needs again meant that serfdom had to be abolished, and that modern sanitation had to be introduced. Thus one need led to another, so that the whole society had to be reformed. In typically Russian fashion, all these things were undertaken by government action, but as one reform led to another, it became a question whether the autocracy and the landed upper classes would be willing to allow the reform movement to go so far as to jeopardize their power and privileges. For example, the abolition of serfdom made it necessary for the landed nobility to cease to regard the peasants as private property, whose only contact with the state was through themselves. Similarly, industrialism and urbanism, which create new social classes of bourgeoisie and workers, these new classes inevitably would make political and social demands, very distasteful to the autocracy and the landed nobility. If the reforms led to demands for nationalism, how could a dynastic monarchy, such as the Roman autocracy, yield to such demands without risking the loss of Finland, Poland, the Ukraine, or Armenia? As long as the desire to westernize and the bad conscience of the upper classes worked together, reform advanced. But as soon as the lower classes began to make demands, reaction appeared. On this basis, the history of Russia was an alternation of reform and reaction, from the 18th century to the Revolution of 1917. Peter the Great, 1689 to 1725, and Catherine the Great, 1762 to 1796, were supporters of westernization and reform. Paul I, 1796 to 1801, was a reactionary. Alexander I, 1801 to 1825, and Alexander II, 1855 to 1881, were reformers, while Nicholas I, 1825 to 1855, and Alexander III from 1881 to 1894 were reactionaries. As a consequence of these various activities, by 1864 serfdom had been abolished, and a fairly modern system of law, of justice, and of education had been established. Local government had been somewhat modernized. A fairly good financial and fiscal system had been established, and an army based on universal military service, but lacking in equipment, had been created. On the other hand, the autocracy continued with full power in the hand of weak men, subject to all kinds of personal intrigues of the basest kind. The freed serfs had no adequate lands. The newly literate were subject to a ruthless censorship, which tried to control their reading, writing, and thinking. The newly freed and newly urbanized were subject to constant police supervision. The non-Russian peoples of the empire were subjected to waves of Russification and pan-Slavism. The judicial system and the fiscal system were administered with an arbitrary disregard of all personal rights or equity, and in general the autocracy was both tyrannical and weak. The first period of reform in the 19th century, that under Alexander I, resulted from a fusion of two factors: the conscience-stricken gentry and the westernizing autocracy. Conscience-stricken gentry. This is foolishness. This is foolishness, Carroll Quigley. I am the greater genius and historian of Homer than you. Alexander himself represented both factors. As a result of his reforms and those of his grandmother, Catherine the Great, even earlier, there appeared in Russia for the first time a new educated class, which was wider than the gentry, being recruited from sons of Orthodox priests or of state officials, including army officers, and in general from the fringes of the autocracy and the gentry. When the autocracy became reactionary under Nicholas I, this newly educated group, with some support from the conscience-stricken gentry, formed a revolutionary group called, generally, the intelligentsia. At first, this new group was pro-Western, but later it became increasingly anti-Western and Slavophile because of its disillusionment with the West. In general, the Westernizers argued that Russia was merely a backward and barbaric fringe of Western civilization, and that it had made no cultural contribution of its own in its past, and that it must pass through the same economic, political, and social developments as the West. The Westernizers wished to speed up these developments. The Slavophiles insisted that Russia was an entirely different civilization from Western civilization, and was much superior because it had a profound spirituality, as contrasted with Western materialism. It had a deep irrationality in intimate touch with vital forces and simple living virtues, in contrast to Western rationality, artificiality, and hypocrisy. It had its own native form of social organization, the peasant village, commune, providing a fully satisfying social and emotional life, in contrast to Western frustration of atomistic individualism in sordid cities. And that a socialist society could be built in Russia out of a simple self-governing, cooperative peasant commune without any need to pass along the Western route marked by industrialism, bourgeoisie supremacy, or parliamentary democracy. As industrialism grew in the West in the period 1830 to 1850, the Russian westernizers like P. Y. Chadayev (1793 to 1856) and Alexander Herzen (1812 to 1870) became increasingly disillusioned with the West, especially with its urban slums, factory systems, social disorganization, middle-class money-grubbing and pettiness, its absolutist state, and its advanced weapons. Originally, the westernizers in Russia had been inspired by French thinkers, while the Slavophiles had been inspired by German thinkers like Schelling and Hegel, so that the shift from westernizers to Slavophiles marked a shift from French to Germanic teachers. The Slavophiles supported orthodoxy and monarchy, although they were very critical of the existing Orthodox Church and of the existing autocracy. They claimed that the latter was a Germanic importation, and that the former, instead of remaining a native, organic growth of Slavic spirituality, had become little more than a tool of autocracy. Instead of supporting these institutions, many Slavophiles went out into the villages to get in touch with pure Slavic spirituality and virtue in the shape of the untutored peasant. These missionaries, called Narodniki, were greeted with unconcealed suspicion and distaste by the peasants, because they were city-bred strangers, were educated, and expressed anti-church and anti-governmental ideas. Already disillusioned with the West, the church, and the government, and now rejected by the peasants, the intelligentsia could find no social group on which to base their reform program. The result was the growth of nihilism and of anarchism. Nihilism was a rejection of all conventions in the name of individualism. Both of these concepts understood in a Russian sense. Since man is a man and not an animal because of his individual development and growth in a society made up of conventions, the nihilist rejection of conventions served to destroy man rather than to liberate him as they expected. The destruction of conventions would not raise man to be an angel, but would lower him to be an animal. Moreover, the individual that the nihilists sought to liberate by this destruction of conventions was not what Western culture understands by the word individual. Rather, it was humanity. The nihilists had no respect whatever for the concrete individual or for individual personality. Rather, by destroying all conventions and stripping all persons naked of all conventional distinctions, they hoped to sink everyone, and especially themselves, into the amorphous, indistinguishable mass of humanity. The nihilists were completely atheist, materialist, irrational, doctrinaire, despotic, and violent. They rejected all thought of self so long as humanity suffered. They became atheists because they could not accept a creator who made an evil, incomplete world full of suffering. They rejected all thought, all art, all idealism, all conventions, because these were superficial, unnecessary luxuries, and therefore evil. They rejected marriage because it was conventional bondage on the freedom of love. They rejected private property because it was a tool of individual oppression. Some even rejected clothing as a corruption of natural innocence. They rejected vice and licentiousness as unnecessary upper-class luxuries. As Nicholas Berdyaev put it, it is orthodox asceticism turned inside out, and asceticism without grace. At the base of Russian nihilism, when grasped in its purity and depth, lies the orthodox rejection of the world, the acknowledgement of the sinfulness of all riches and luxury, of all creative profusion in art and in thought. Nihilism considers as sinful luxury not only art, metaphysics, and spiritual values, but religion also. Nihilism is a demand for nakedness, for the stripping of oneself, of all the trappings of culture, for the annihilation of all historical tradition, for the setting free of the natural man. The intellectual asceticism of nihilism found no expression in materialism. Any more subtle philosophy was proclaimed a sin. Not to be a materialist was to be taken as a moral suspect. If you were not a materialist, then you were in favor of the enslavement of man both intellectually and politically. Note Nicholas Berdyaev, Origin of Russian Communism. London, Geoffrey Bless, 1948. Whew. I think this is a bit of thinking out of fact. This fantastic philosophy is of great significance because it prepared the ground for Bolshevism. Out of the same spiritual sickness which produced nihilism emerged anarchism. To the anarchist, as revealed by the founder of the movement, Mikhail Bakunin, 1814–1876, the chief of all enslaving and needless conventionalities was the state. The discovery that the state was not identical with society, a discovery which the West had made 1,000 years earlier than Russia, could have been a liberating discovery to Russia if, like the West, the Russians had been willing to accept both state and society, each in its proper place. But this was quite impossible in the Russian tradition of fanatical totalitarianism. To this tradition, the totalitarian state had been found evil and must accordingly be completely destroyed, and replaced by the totalitarian society in which the individual could be absorbed. Anarchism was the next step after the disillusionment of the Narodniki and the agitations of the nihilists. The revolutionary intelligentsia, unable to find any social group on which to base their reform program, and convinced of the evil of all conventional establishments and of the latent perfection in the Russian masses, adopted a program of pure political direct action of the simplest kind, assassination. Merely by killing the leaders of states, not only in Russia but throughout the world, governments could be eliminated and the masses freed from social cooperation and agrarian socialism. From this background came the assassination of Tsar Alexander II in 1881, of King Humbert of Italy in 1900, of President McKinley in 1901, as well as many anarchist outrages in Russia, Spain, and Italy in the period 1890 to 1910. The failure of governments to disappear in the face of this terrorist agitation, especially in Russia, where the oppression of autocracy increased after 1881, led little by little to a fading of the intelligentsia's faith in destructive violence as a constructive action, as well as in the satisfying peasant commune, and in the survival of natural innocence in the unthinking masses. Just at this point, about 1890, a great change began in Russia. Western industrialism began to grow under governmental and foreign auspices, and urban proletariat began to appear, and Marxist social theory came in from Germany. The growth of industrialism settled the violent academic dispute between Westerners and Slavophiles as to whether Russia must follow the path of Western development or could escape it by falling back on some native Slavic solutions hidden in the peasant commune. The growth of the proletariat gave the revolutionaries once again a social group on which to build, and Marxist theory gave the intelligentsia an ideology which they could fanatically embrace. These new developments, by lifting Russia from the impasse it had reached in 1885, were generally welcomed. Even the autocracy lifted the censorship to allow Marxist theory to circulate, in the belief that it would alleviate terrorist pressure since it eschewed direct political action, especially assassination, and postponed revolution until after industrialization had proceeded far enough to create a fully developed bourgeois class and a fully developed proletariat. To be sure, the theory created by Marx's mid-19th century Germanic background was, as we shall see, gradually changed by the age-long Russian outlook, at first by the Leninist Bolshevik triumph over the Mensheviks, and later by Stalin's Russian nationalist victory over Lenin's more Western rationalism. But in the period 1890 to 1914, the stalemate of opposed violence was broken, and progress, punctuated by violence and intolerance, appeared. This period of progress, punctuated by violence which lasted from 1890 to 1914, has a number of aspects. Of these, the economic and social development will be discussed first, followed by the political, and lastly the ideological. As late as the liberation of the serfs in 1863, Russia was practically untouched by the industrial process, and was indeed more backward by far than Britain and France had been before the invention of the steam engine itself. Owing to lack of roads, transportation was very poor except for the excellent system of rivers, and these were frozen for months each year. Mud tracks, impassable for part of the year and only barely passable for the rest of the time, left villages relatively isolated, with the result that almost all handicraft products and much agricultural produce were locally produced and locally consumed. The serfs were impoverished after liberation, and held at a low standard of living by having a large part of their produce taken from them as rents to landlords and as taxes to the state bureaucracy. This served to drain a considerable fraction of the country's agricultural and mineral production to the cities and to the export market. This fraction provided capital for the growth of a modern economy after 1863, being exported to pay for the import of the necessary machinery and industrial raw materials. This was supplemented by the direct importation of capital from abroad, especially from Belgium and France, while much capital, especially for railroads, was provided by the government. Foreign capital amounted to about one-third of all industrial capital in 1890, and rose to almost one-half by 1900. The proportions varied from one activity to another, the foreign portion being in 1900 at 70% in the field of mining, 42% in the field of metallurgical industry, but less than 10% in textiles. At the same day, the entire capital of the railroads amounted to 4,700 million rubles, of which 3,500 million belonged to the government. These two sources were of very great importance because, except in textiles, most industrial development was based on the railroads, and the earliest enterprises in heavy industry, apart from the old charcoal metallurgy of the Ural Mountains, were foreign. The first great railroad concession, that of the main company for 2,650 miles of line, was given to a French company in 1857. A British corporation opened the exploitation of the great southern iron ore basin at Krivoy Rog, while the German Nobel brothers began the development of the petroleum industry at Baku, both about 1880. I thought they were Swedes. As a consequence of these factors, the Russian economy remained largely but decreasingly a colonial economy for most of the period 1863 to 1940. There was a very low standard of living for the Russian people, with excessive exportation of consumers' commodities, even those badly needed by the Russian people themselves, these being used to obtain foreign exchange, to buy industrial or luxury commodities of foreign origin to be owned by the very small ruling class. Well, I think that saying that standard of living was very low is contradicted by Khrushchev, who I remember seeing when he was a common worker in Ukraine, in the Donbass, in Yuzovka, wore a evening tuxedo to his wedding, and was very smart, and had a wonderful, he said it in his memoirs, a wonderful apartment, where he was a skilled worker in one of the factories there. And he admitted that after the Bolshevik Revolution, the standard of living of him as a leader of the Moscow party was indeed lower than when he was a worker in Yuzovka. So this claim by Quigley that the state of the Russian economy was so dire before 1914 is simply not true. This pattern of Russian economic organization has continued under the Soviet regime since 1917. The first Russian railroad opened in 1838, but growth was slow until the establishment of a rational plan of development in 1857. This plan sought to penetrate the chief agricultural regions, especially the Black Earth region of the south, in order to connect them with the chief cities of the north and the export ports. At that time there were only 663 miles of railroads, but this figure went up over tenfold by 1871, doubled again by 1881 with 14,000 miles, reached 37,000 by 1901, and 46,400 miles by 1915. This building took place in two great waves, the first in the decade 1866 to 1875, and the second in the 15 years 1891 to 1905. In these two periods, averages of over 1,400 miles of track were constructed annually, while in the intervening 15 years, from 1876 to 1890, the average construction was only 631 miles per year. The decrease in the middle period resulted from the Great Depression in Western Europe of 1873 to 1893, and culminated in Russia in the terrible famine of 1891. After this last date, railroad construction was pushed vigorously by Count Sergei Witte, who advanced from station master to Minister of Finance, holding the latter post from 1892 to 1903. His greatest achievement was the single-tracked Trans-Siberian Line, which ran 6,365 miles from the Polish frontier to Vladivostok, and was built in the 14 years 1891 to 1905. This line, by permitting Russia to increase her political pressure in the Far East, brought Britain into alliance with Japan 1902, and brought Russia into war with Japan 1904 to 1905. The railroads had a most profound effect on Russia from every point of view, binding 1/6 of the Earth's surface into a single political unit, and transforming that country's economic, political, and social life. New areas, chiefly in the steppes, which had previously been too far from markets to be used for any purpose but pastoral activities, were brought under cultivation, chiefly for grains and cotton, thus competing with the central black soil area. The drain of wealth from the peasants to the urban and export markets was increased, especially in the period before 1890. This process was assisted by the advent of a money economy to those rural areas which had previously been closer to a self-sufficient or a barter basis. This increased agricultural specialization and weakened handicraft activities. The collection of rural products, which had previously been in the hands of a few large commercial operators who worked slowly on a long-term basis, largely through Russia's more than 6,000 annual fairs, were after 1870, thanks to the railroad, replaced by a horde of small, quick turnover middlemen who swarmed like ants through the countryside, offering the contents of their small pouches of money and for grain, hemp hides, fats, bristles, and feathers. This drain of goods from the rural areas was encouraged by the government through quotas and restrictions, price differentials, and different railroad rates and taxes for the same commodities with different destinations. As a result, Russian sugar sold in London for about 40% of its price in Russia itself. Russia, with a domestic consumption of 10.5 pounds of sugar per capita compared with England's 92 pounds per capita, nevertheless exported in 1900 a quarter of its total production of 1,802 million pounds. In the same year, Russia exported almost 12 million pounds of cotton goods, chiefly to Persia and China, although domestic consumption of cotton in Russia was only 5.3 pounds per capita compared to England's 39 pounds. In petroleum products, where Russia had 48% of the total world production in 1900, about 13.3% was exported, although Russian consumption was only 12 pounds per capita each year compared to Germany's 42 pounds. In one of these products, kerosene, where Russia had the strongest potential domestic demand, almost 60% of the domestic production was exported. The full extent of this drain of wealth from the rural areas can be judged from the export figures in general. In 1891 to 1895, rural products formed 75% and cereals 40% of the total value of all Russian exports. Moreover, it was the better grains which were exported, a quarter of the wheat crop compared to 1/15 of the rye crop in 1900. That there was a certain improvement in this respect as time passed can be seen from the fact that the portion of the wheat crop exported fell from half in the 1880s to 1/6 in 1912 to 1913. This policy of siphoning wealth into the export market gave Russia a favorable balance of trade, that is, excess of exports over imports, for the whole period after 1875, providing gold and foreign exchange which allow the country to build up its gold reserve and to provide capital for its industrial development. In addition, billions of rubles were obtained by sales of bonds of the Russian government, largely in France, as part of the French effort to build up the Triple Entente. The State Bank, which had increased its gold reserve from 475 million to 1,095 million rubles in the period 1890 to 1897, was made a bank of issue in 1897 and was required by law to redeem its notes in gold, thus placing Russia on the international gold standard. The number of corporations in Russia increased from 504, with 912 million rubles capital, of which 215 million was foreign, in 1889, to 1,181 corporations, with 1,737 million rubles capital, of which over 800 million was foreign in 1899. The proportion of industrial concerns among these corporations steadily increased, being 58% of the new capital flotations. in 1874-1881 as compared to only 11% in 1861 to 1873. Much of the impetus to industrial advance came from the railroads, since these in the last decade of the 19th century were by far the chief purchasers of ferrous metals, coal and petroleum products. As a result, there was a spectacular outburst of economic productivity in this decade, followed by a decade of lower prosperity after 1900. The production of pig iron in the period 1860 to 1870 ranged about 350,000 tons a year, rose to 997,000 tons in 1890, to almost 1.6 million tons in 1895, and reached a peak of 3.3 million tons in 1900. During this period, iron production shifted from the charcoal foundries of the Urals to the modern coke furnaces of the Ukraine, the percentages of the total Russian production being 67% from the Urals to 6% from the south in 1870, and 20% from the Urals with 67% from the south in 1913. The production figure for 1900 was not exceeded during the next decade, but rose after 1909 to reach 4.6 million tons in 1913. This compared with 14.4 million tons in Germany,